There we are. All right. So I see we've got our attendees starting to roll in. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all very, very much for joining us. We will be starting the presentation at the top of the hour. We're just making sure all of our tech is set up the way we want it to be. I see we've got about 6 people jumping on a little bit early. I think our total attendee list right now is 47 or 48. So we'll be pretty busy when it's all said and done. But I do want to take a moment to welcome you as you're coming in, and you'll hear me say this a couple more times in the next couple minutes. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to enter them into the chat or Q&A panels, and myself or our panelists will get to them as we go along today. So the presentation will start just after the top of the hour, so I certainly hope you have the opportunity to relax, get comfortable, grab yourself a nice drink. I'm just drinking water. and yeah, we will start in just a few minutes. My screen shows up there all right, guys?
Yep.
Perfect. Cool. All right. Yes, you said that the storm's already started where you are, Laura?
Yeah, it rolled through maybe 20 minutes ago. Thunder and lightning, no rain, but now the rain's starting to come down. So it's definitely coming your way.
Yeah, so. Both the three of you get it long before I do, right? Did you guys have it this morning, Nina, Sarah?
Yeah, like it's dark right now, and we heard a lot of thunderstorms. I haven't seen the rain yet, but a lot of thundering.
Yeah, it's just really dark this morning. It felt like it was night, and it's getting a little lighter now, but we haven't got any rain or anything like that.
It was lovely here until like 20 minutes ago, and then it got really calm and really dark.
Yeah.
So, yeah. No, it's the perfect time to run a presentation. No one wants to be outside right now.
No,
yeah, exactly.
So we will start in just a couple more minutes. I see we've got more people rolling in. Welcome to those of you just joining. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to pop them into the chat or Q&A panel. Either myself or Laura or Sarah or Nina will get to them as we go along. There's the thunder now. Perfect timing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gone.
I was just thinking that. I'm not sure how long it's going to stay.
Yeah.
I'll have to check the weather again, but I think it's supposed to calm down a bit here at least. So
yeah, it's off.
I think we're expecting a storm till about 6 o'clock, if memory serves me right. It's supposed to kind of hit and miss around here for the next few hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I see we've got a nice group of people that have logged in early. Good stuff. So we see it is now the top of the hour. We will have people logging in over the next few minutes. So as we get set up, again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our presentation of the overdose crisis with a spotlight on opioids as well as sedatives and stimulants. Now, we will get into the meat of the presentation here in just a couple of minutes. While we are waiting, I will take a moment to introduce myself for those of you that are unfamiliar, although I see some familiar names on here, so I think most people are. For those of you that aren't, my name is Steve Keller. I am the content creator and national speaker for Drug Free Kids Canada. I've been working in public speaking around substance use and addiction since 2015. I'm presenting to you from beautiful, cloudy, hazy, about to be very stormy Peterborough, Ontario, upon territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory. I've been very, very fortunate, both as a child and as an adult, to be able to spend time in the communities of Tyendinaga as a youth, where I had my grandmother live, as well as in Peterborough while I was working up here for the Y for a number of years. I had many opportunities to visit and attend and work partnerships with the NAIDOP communities, whether that be Hiawatha, Alderville, Curve Lake, Oneida, or of course Tyendinaga. And I know often when we hear land acknowledgements, we talk about the history of the land and the celebration of the culture, which is vital. But one thing I have learned is that it's important to really acknowledge that by actually visiting those communities. I've come out many times over the years, and every single time I get to go, I'm overjoyed. It's wonderful how accessible the community is, how sort of social they are. We often talk about the importance of of community development and community wellness, sort of furthering and supporting individual well-being. And it's something that I find many of the partners that I've worked with, whether that be in the Anishinaabe or the Haudenosaunee communities, have really exemplified. And so I encourage, especially many of the partners and professionals that are working today, if you are looking for ways to learn and work towards community growth, I strongly recommend you connect with those Indigenous partners. And without further ado, I see we're up to about 15 people. Those numbers will continue to grow. I will take a moment to allow my my co-presenters to introduce themselves. We'll start with Laura, and then we'll go to Sarah and Nina. Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Steve. I'm Laura. I am actually a placement student with DFK, and I've probably been with them now for going on 2.5 months. So I am in a social service worker program at Fleming College. And yeah, I'm happy to be co-facilitating here today with Sarah and Nina and Steve. So looking forward to that. Nina or Sarah?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Sarah Keeman, and I'm a graduate student at Humber College's Addictions and Mental Health program. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to present alongside Nina and Laura and Steve today, and I really hope you guys enjoy our presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nina Keeman, and I'm also a graduate student at the Humber College's Addictions and Mental Health program. And along with Sarah, who is actually my sister, we are enjoying our time here at DFK, and I hope you guys enjoy your presentation today and look forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, for those of you that are joining today, I mentioned this a moment ago. You'll notice that we titled the presentation as the overdose crisis, not as the opioid crisis, as we often hear it referred to in media and through the news. And the reason that we've done this is one thing that we have seen in terms of the drug supplies, the hospitalizations, the fatalities, the harms, and the risks around substance use in general has shown an increasing sort of, I'll say, confusion or dilution of the drug supply, particularly the illicit market, of whether that's opioids being mislabeled as sedatives, sedatives being mislabeled as opioids, stimulants being mislabeled as any of the other two, or significant cases of individuals being hospitalized believing they took one substance only to find that they test positive for any of the three classes that we see here today, as well as 2 or 3 of them. We've heard testimonials of this in Kingston region, whereby individuals are hospitalized believing that they've taken fentanyl only to test positive for heroin and methamphetamine. We've heard cases of this here in Peterborough, where individuals are hospitalized believing they took meth, coming in to find that they've tested positive for heroin and fentanyl. The point is that these substances are different. They have different effects. They carry different risks. But in many cases, individuals are finding themselves taking them, but not realizing that's what's being consumed. So with that in mind, the presentation that we've done today does not spotlight one class of drugs, but instead 3. And we will get into all 3 today. And in doing so, we need to make sure that we understand the key terminology of the 3 classes of substances we will be looking at. First and foremost, we have opioids. Now, what we know about opioids is that these are a class of drug that are used to manage pain. And we'll talk about common examples of opioids, medical opioids, and illicit opioids as we go along. We also know that they are used recreationally to produce feelings of euphoria. They can cause feelings of calmness, pleasure, excitement, relaxation, joy. These feelings can be very quick, but they can also be very brief. That overwhelming feeling of euphoria combined with that ability for the substance to take away feelings of pain can make these substances quite addictive or quite dependent for individuals, leading to long and short-term health complications, which we will get into. We're also going to discuss sedatives today. Now, sedatives perform similar functions to opioids, but with marked differences. These medications slow down functions in the human body. They can be used medically to reduce symptoms of anxiety, support with sleeping issues, or to help keep a person unconscious during surgery. Now, for anyone listening today, some people may say, well, they've never taken an opioid. They've never known someone who's taken an opioid or a sedative. To which I say, anyone who has gone under the knife for surgery, anyone who's had to be put out for any major surgery. I had oral surgery when I was a teen. I was given a sedative. I was given an opioid afterwards to manage the pain. These are used for many medical reasons, but they can also be used recreationally, which increases capacity for them to possibly be misused or abused. And finally, we have stimulants. Now, stimulants operate a little bit differently, but they need to be included in this presentation for reasons that you'll see as we go along. These are substances that increase the level of activity of the central nervous system. They can be used to elevate blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing, as well as several other medical uses that we will talk about towards the end of the workshop. But again, it's important to note that these 3 substances are used interchangeably, but they each stand as their own sort of existing property. And we'll talk about these as we go. Now, as we go along in presentations, we do like to include poll questions and trivia questions to make sure our audience is engaging. You can feel free to put your answers in the chat panel. So the first question I have is for youth in Canada. In 2022, youth were more likely overall to report using blank in the past year to get high. Now, do you believe this is illegal drugs or pharmaceuticals and medications? Please feel free to put your responses into the chat panel. Now, while our audience is thinking about this, Sarah, before you started doing placement here, if I had asked you this question, what do you think you would have answered? What do you think would have been more likely?
I think I think for sure for myself, like I would have said illegal drugs for sure.
Illegal drugs. They get a lot of attention, right? They get a lot of attention. Now, a significant portion of our audience is leaning towards that pharmaceutical and medication side, and I would say this is likely informed, as I know many of our audience work in agencies that I've worked with over the years, and you would be correct. Illegal drugs get a lot of attention, and for good reason. We'll talk a little bit about them today. But really, it's worth noting that pharmaceuticals and medications were more likely to be consumed by youth, particularly teens, than illicit drugs were. Now, stimulants among teens were the most commonly reported pharmaceutical product. By the time we got to post-secondary, we saw opioids reported at a slightly higher number. And when we looked at illegal drug use, we found hallucinogens were the most commonly reported illicit substance used. Now, the use of all substances increases with age. There is a caveat there that over-the-counter medications, things like dextromethorphan and sleeping aids and Gravol and the like, tend to be consumed at a lower rate among older audiences. Now, this often has to do with the availability and the accessibility that they may have to a various range of drugs and products that will increase as they get older, which would decrease the likelihood of them turning to these products to use for various reasons. Now, it's important when we're discussing substance use and reasons for use to really be able to, strictly and explicitly identify what those reasons are. Now, for the audience listening, I'm going to pose this as an open-ended question and ask why you believe that youth may choose to use substances. Particularly, why would they use opioids? Why would they use sedatives? And why would they use stimulants? Feel free to let me know what you think. And while they're thinking about it, Nina, if I were to ask you, why do you think young people use substances like these? What would be an answer you might give?
Curiosity, just wondering what it's like. Like they want to try it out. Something that they've heard their friends maybe do it. They want to try it. Yeah. One of the reasons.
Absolutely. I see curiosity as a commonly cited response. I see responses in the panel, including escape, stress, fun, as a potential coping mechanism to alter emotional state, to reduce pain, to support feelings of joy or happiness, boredom. If you were to ask every youth in a group of 30 this question, they'll all give you different answers. And it's important to understand that different people have completely different reasons for use. Now, sometimes curiosity is one that parents express concerns about, or they communicate concerns, to which I often like to remind them that the majority of youth that actually report substance use out of curiosity do not actually continue using substances that they've tried using. And this is similar to anything else that a teen would try doing out of curiosity. They try something, they find an interest in it, they continue. They try it, they don't like it, they don't keep doing it. It's similar to any other thing we try doing in our life. Now, some of the other reasons, as our audience is alluding to quite well, include feelings of pleasure, fun, excitement, the perceived differences of pharmaceuticals and illicit drugs. It's important to note that we found this in our tracking surveys, and it's been echoed in a multitude of national surveys as well, that youth are more likely to report using pharmaceuticals because they perceive them as less harmful. Now, whether or not this is true is something that we will certainly discuss as we go along today, but this is a misconception that many young people fall under when they choose whether or not to use a pharmaceutical for recreational purposes. Many may be prescribed a pharmaceutical by a healthcare provider, as we'll talk about particularly with stimulant sedatives a little bit later today, as well as opioids. But we also have that idea of self-medication. Some people may choose to use a substance to alter their state of feeling, whether that's coping with stress or anxiety, for which this fall we will actually be doing a larger scale workshop on the mechanisms of stress, anxiety, depression, and how various substances interact with these. Some may actually use them to maintain some form of emotional or personal balance. And finally, others may choose to use, particularly in the case of opioids or anti-inflammatories, as a way of managing pain. Now, the reasons for non-use, you'll notice that the list you see on the right is actually quite similar to the list that we see on the left. We have individuals not wanting to use because they're worried about what the consequences can be. Now, some say they're curious about how they feel, so they choose to use. Others say they don't know how they'll feel, so they choose not to use. Some people talk about pleasure, others cite negative experiences. Some talk about the fact they were given a substance by a provider. Others say they don't wish to use because they don't want to be stereotyped or discriminated against for using a substance. Some people cite a specific lack of interest. They don't want to feel different when they use substances. And one thing I've talked about in previous programs, and I'll always bring this up, is that the reasons for youth consumption to start using a substance are not often the reasons that they continue to use. A youth may choose to use a substance to feel a certain degree of pleasure or fun, but over time, if they find themselves developing a tolerance or a dependency to using said substance, they may begin to use as a way of maintaining a sense of balance in their life as they feel unwell when they can't use. For others, they may choose not to use substances initially out of a lack of interest. They don't really seem to have that curiosity. And then as they get older, they choose not to because they see others experience negative effects. And it's important to understand both sides of these in a given conversation to help really diagnose and identify where a youth lies on a spectrum of use, which we'll show towards the end of the presentation, and be able to sort of meet them where we're at, as we often speak about in the social service sector. Now, like I said, this presentation will get into the meat of 3 different substances. So we're going to jump right into the first one, that being opioids. Now, Sarah's going to cover a great deal of the technical know-how of this presentation in this section. My job is really just to, pop up some survey questions and add in commentary a little as we go. So I'm going to start off with a survey question here for the audience. 5 years ago, in 2019, Health Canada estimated that 1 in blank Canadians over the age of 15 experienced chronic pain. Now, is that 1 in 20, 1 in 10, 1 in 5, or 1 in 4? What does our audience think here? 1 in 10, 1 in 5, 1 in 10, 1 in 5. Fairly significant numbers on both cases, right? 1 in 20, 10. Well, the answer here is actually higher than many people think. It's actually 1 in 5. Approximately 20% of Canadians over the age of 15 report experiencing chronic pain, according to Health Canada. Now, what else do we really know then in response to this idea of pain and opioid use, Sarah?
So we know that opioids are prescribed for various reasons, with the most common being pain relief, whether it's short-term or long-term use. Since 2015, approximately 1 in 8 Canadians 15 or older have been prescribed an opioid each year. Now, they might have been given after a surgery, for injuries from a car accident, or even to treat chronic pain from different health issues. Sometimes they're even used for less common reasons, like treating severe diarrhea or cough. And while some known and well examples are oxycodone, morphine, codeine, and fentanyl.
Absolutely. And I like that you kind of alluded to the list that we have here, right? We see Oxycontin, we see morphine, we see codeine, we see methadone. And I always like showing the common examples of opioids here because when we have this conversation, many people don't actually know what other opioids are. They heard of fentanyl, and many have heard of heroin. But there are many that don't actually recognize that other painkillers like codeine and morphine are actually in the same class of substances. Now, it's also worth noting that heroin use is not legal in Canada unless obtained through the urgent public need process. So it is a largely illicit substance to use. And I also like that you identified those lesser known reasons or supports for using opioids, which leads me to my next question. You mentioned that opioids have been used in the past to manage cough suppressants and found in medicines. Now, which of the following opioids that you see on the right-hand side have actually been used in the past in cough suppressants and commercially produced medicines? Is it codeine, morphine, heroin, or all of the above? C4 for all, C4 for all. Got a group that's right on the ball today. It throws people off a little bit sometimes when they see that heroin was formerly used for cough suppressants. A lot of people don't know that heroin was actually created by the Bayer company. And initially, the reason that heroin was sort of developed from an analog of the opium plant was that it was meant to be used in pain management, but also in cough suppressants and children cough medicines. Now, the problem was Bayer quickly found out in the first couple of years after mass producing this product for consumption that people were stealing the bottles and drinking the whole bottle and going to sleep at night and not waking up in the morning. And there were reasons for this. What could you tell us about the history or a little bit about the opioid use in Canada, Sarah?
Yeah, so opioids have played a role in medicine for thousands of years, like you said, often used to alleviate colds, pain, and even restlessness. However, due to their addictive nature, many were banned for non-medical use, except for the use by licensed professionals. So, for example, opioids like codeine were used in cough syrups, but most often are now being replaced with medications like dextromethorphan, which is still risky, but still less harmful than other opioids. Now, opioids work by affecting the sensory nerves in the brain that are linked to the nervous system and lungs. So they interfere with the body's ability to feel pain or irritation, such as the urge to cough, and slow down natural breathing processes. So while they're effective in relieving pain and inducing feelings of euphoria, opioids can be highly addictive and have dangerous side effects. So using opioids can actually lead to feelings of drowsiness, constipation, vomiting, headaches, dizziness, and even confusion. So they're particularly risky during pregnancy and can even potentially cause fetal withdrawal symptoms in newborns. The most serious dangers include loss of consciousness, difficulty breathing, and even potentially fatal respiratory arrest if the opioid impairs the brain's receptors connected to our lung.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, speaking a little bit about the medical uses of opioids, we know they can be used as a painkiller and as a pain manager. Let's just say that I was prescribed codeine as a painkiller. I separated my shoulder, or I broke a collarbone. And let's say I'm out with my partner and we're walking our dogs, and my wife slips and busts her ankle, or sprains her ankle. Am I legally allowed to give her my codeine? We're both experiencing pain. What does our audience think? Do we accept this as true, or do we challenge this? I see a no here. I see a no. I like that the audience is voting in that direction. This is something very important to challenge. This is something that people think they're being helpful, right? We think we're helping each other when we see pain, but it is against the law to offer opioids to someone else, even if they're experiencing the same sort of medical distress that you are. There's only one sort of source where a person can legally be given an opioid, and I'll leave that to Sarah to explain a little more.
For sure. So it's important to use opioids safely, not just for your own well-being, but for the safety of those around you. So if you're using an opioid, just make sure to follow the prescription provided by your healthcare provider for as long as it's advised. Opioids can also impair your thinking and perception, so it's essential to use them in a safe environment around trusted individuals. And additionally, opioids can actually interact dangerously with alcohol and other drugs, so it's important to avoid mixing them with any other substances. So if you're taking other medications, just inform your healthcare provider before starting and just to understand the potential risks associated with combining them or even exploring alternative options. Now, remember not to share your opioids with anyone else, like Steve alluded earlier. And doing so is not only dangerous, but it is illegal. So only licensed healthcare professionals can actually distribute opioids. Remember to store opioids in a secure location at your home just to prevent accidental access by children or pets. Sharing medications can be risky, so as others may not react to them in the same way that you do, especially if they have different medical conditions or unknown underlying health issues. Lastly, protect your community by returning any unused opioids to your pharmacy. Disposing them down the drain can actually contaminate our wastewater and harm our environment. Drug Free Kids Canada actually organizes National Drug Drop Off Month every August, encouraging Canadians to bring back their unused medications to pharmacies for safe disposal.
Absolutely. We actually have an activation event coming up for that next month in partnership with HPSA as well as Rexall. So we do encourage anyone that's working with clients, particularly those using prescription medications, to remind them of the importance of returning those unused substances and expired substances, rather, to pharmacies for safe and proper disposal. Next question. What have opioids contributed to the overdose crisis? Well, we know that opioid use in Canada has contributed to a significant number of fatalities over the last several years. But what is that number? Is it 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, or 40,000 Canadian fatalities associated with opioids between 2016 and 2023? A lot of people guessing high, 30,000, 40,000, 20,000. This number is quite significant. Now, I bring up the example all the time. So I live in Peterborough. Population of Peterborough is about 80 to 85,000 people. The amount of fatalities attributed to opioids in the last 7 years is the equivalent of half of the population of the city that I live in. It's 40,000 people. Sarah?
Yeah, so opioids have evolved significantly in the last century, leading to the creation of really potent products such as heroin. More recently, fentanyl has been developed to treat severe pain, but has also been widely misused due to its potency. So, fentanyl is actually 20 to 40 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. So, many drug users, particularly those obtaining drugs from unregulated sources, may unknowingly come into contact with fentanyl as it's often mixed with other illegal substances. So illegal fentanyl enters the drug market through importation, illegal production, and theft from medical sources, and it's frequently mixed with heroin, cocaine, benzodiazepines or methamphetamines, and falsely labeled as prescription opioids. So between 2016 and 2023, we know that 40,000 Canadians have died and 39,000 have been hospitalized due to opioid use, with fentanyl being a significant contributing factor. So in 2016, fentanyl was actually found in 47% of all opioid toxicity deaths. And by 2022, this number had risen to actually 84%. Now, non-pharmaceutical opioids were involved in 80% of the overdoses in 2023. So the percentage of all opioid-related poisonings and hospitalizations involved fentanyl and its analogs have increased by 100% since 2018 when the national surveillance began. So we learned basically that an estimated 40,642 people died of an opioid overdose during this period. And shockingly, 96% of these fatalities were accidental. And in 2023, 72% of those who died were male, and the majority of the deaths were among people aged 20 to 59. So here are some things to look out for when we have an overdose that involves an opioid. So an overdose of opioids can happen very quickly and often just within 2 minutes of its use. So when this occurs, opioids bind to the receptors in the brain that control our breathing, which can actually cause our respiratory system to shut down. So some things to look out for an overdose would be pale skin, pinpoint pupils, extreme drowsiness, loss of consciousness, the inability to be woken up by shouting or shaking or touching, slow, irregular, or no breathing at all, and slow to no heartbeat. So recognizing these signs early and responding quickly can be life-saving.
Now, when we talk about the responding to these situations, we often hear conversations around naloxone and Narcan, and you can't really do a presentation about the opioid sort of situation without having an understanding and a discussion about Narcan. Now, today we are going to talk about its uses, but we are going to talk a little bit later about some of its limitations because it's equally important to understand those. Now, Narcan or naloxone is known as an opioid antagonist, which means either that it can reverse the effect of an overdose or strengthens the effects of opioids. What does our audience think here? Reverse. You would be correct. So I did see a question in that why is it that we can get acetaminophen? Now, acetaminophen is not technically an opioid, but we know that codeine increasingly has actually been removed from many medications. In fact, codeine isn't even recommended for young people in general under the age of 12, whereas DXM or dextromethorphan, which has been increasingly replacing codeine in many of these current pharmaceutical products, is not actually recommended for anyone under the age of 6. Now, dextromethorphan doesn't really work as an opioid. It sort of acts like an opioid, but it does still present risk for younger youth that choose to use. So it is generally recommended that people under the age of 6 do not consume DXM. And to answer your question again about codeine, we're starting to see increasingly that more and more producers of pharmaceutical products are moving away from codeine in commercially available products. And to go back to our audience's response here to the poll, you are correct. It is used to reverse the effect of an opioid. Sarah?
So naloxone, like you said, was an opioid antagonist. That means that it binds to the receptors in the brain in place of the opioids, temporarily reversing their effects. So this can cause a person to start breathing again if they stop. Now, naloxone is not addictive, nor is it a psychoactive. It will not change how a person thinks or acts. Multiple doses can actually be given to a person as well. Naloxone is actually available in injectable and nasal sprays, and its sole purpose is to reverse the effects of an opioid overdose. It's important to note, though, that naloxone's effects are temporary. So it starts working within 2 to 5 minutes and lasts about 20 to 90 minutes. Now, while this can help save a life, its effects only last a short while. So whereas opioid effects can actually last for hours. So you may be required to use multiple uses of naloxone. Several provinces across Canada actually offer free take-home naloxone kits at their pharmacies, and they're available to anyone who asks. In fact, did you guys know that in 2023, Occupational Health and Safety Act requires workplaces where employers are at risk of an overdose to have life-saving naloxone kits? So some of the risks may include if an employee is experiencing an opioid overdose at work, or if an employee voluntarily discloses their use, if it's been observed that opioid use has been discovered in the workplace, if there is discarded paraphernalia such as needles found, and if the Joint Health and Safety Committee or workplace members bring to the attention the risk of opioid use to the employer. Now, the signs of an overdose, as discussed earlier, is the first step to supporting someone who may be experiencing an overdose. So remember, it's important to watch out for signs like clammy skin, passing out or nodding off, and shallow or no breathing. So an overdose is a medical emergency and it can be really scary to witness. So if you are with someone experiencing an overdose, I think it's really crucial to stay with them. Call 911 or the local emergency helpline immediately. Now, if you have naloxone, administer it to the person as soon as you are able, as those actions can save their life.
Absolutely. And as you referred to a moment ago, it's important to note that naloxone does not necessarily last as long as the opioid overdose. So if you have a client or you have an individual that says they've administered naloxone or they want to administer naloxone, they still need to call emergency services. Because even if they do give it to a person who has fallen unconscious, they begin breathing and they wake up, there's no guarantee they're going to continue to stay conscious or that they're going to continue to breathe. So they still need to contact EMS. If they have to administer naloxone, they have to make that call as well. Excellent job, Sarah. Couldn't have done it better myself. Let's move on to the second analog that we're going to discuss today. Let's talk about sedatives. Now, for this, I'm going to share the floor here with Nina for the next little while, and we're going to introduce with a bit of a question for the audience. Sedatives have a multitude of names. You've heard them referred to as many, many different names, and Nina's going to give you a full list in a moment. But I'm going to give you one of the other identifications right now. Sedatives are medications known as a blank because they slow down functions in the central nervous system. Would that be hallucinogens, anti-inflammatories, depressants, or none of the above? Depressants. Very down kind of conversation here, eh? Get it? Because I don't get how much. I see a lot of votes here on depressants, and you would be correct. The reason we wanted to bring this up is that these terms are often used interchangeably, so it's important that we understand that they are talking about the same thing. Now, there are many other names for sedatives as well, right, Nina?
Yeah, sometimes you may also see in literature that sedatives can be referred to as a hypnotic or even tranquilizers. Now, in Canada, sedatives are prescribed for a range of medical reasons and come in various forms, including pills, suppositories, and injections. And each type of sedative serves a specific purpose. For example, benzodiazepines are widely used to alleviate anxiety and panic disorders, so they're providing crucial relief to those who are affected. We've got barbiturates, and they're often prescribed as sleeping aids for those who may be grappling with an insomnia. And additionally, we have anesthetics, which possess sedative properties and are vital to ensuring that patients remain unconscious and comfortable during surgical procedures. Now, sedatives can also play a crucial role in treating symptoms of alcohol withdrawal, so including delirium treatments or DTs. Now, DTs can occur when an individual with an alcohol use disorder attempts to quit drinking, which can lead to severe health risks such as extreme spikes in their blood pressure, tremors, hallucinations, aggression, and even sudden mood swings. Now, sedatives can help manage these symptoms, but it's essential that they are taken only with a prescription and under the careful supervision of a healthcare professional. Now, I'm not sure, have any of you guys heard of double doctoring? Well, this term refers to, good, some of you have, some of you haven't, okay. Well, this term refers to the illegal practice of visiting multiple doctors within a 30-day period to obtain extra prescriptions for sedatives. Now, engaging in this practice can result in severe consequences, including up to 18 months in prison. Moreover, the activities such as trafficking, importing, exporting, or producing sedatives are also illegal and can lead up to prison sentences to up to 3 years. So it's important that understanding these laws is crucial to avoid such serious repercussions. Now, sometimes you may see In 2022, the CCSA, also known as the Canadian Centre for Substance Use and Addiction, reported that 1 in 10 Canadians aged 15 and older are using prescription sedatives, which may be for various reasons. Now, while sedative use does not initially seem prevalent as stimulants or even opioids, it's also worth noting that the most common substance that Canadians report using is actually alcohol and is classified as a CNS depressant, otherwise known as a central nervous system depressant. Now, the non-medical use of sedatives has been increasing among young people in the recent years. And the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey reported that the psychoactive use of sedatives among teens increased from 1% up to 4% between the years of 2014 to 2018. Furthermore, 2/3 of post-secondary students who reported using sedatives non-medically said they did so to experience the feelings of being high. Now, this was the most common non-medical reason for use and was reported at a higher rate than both stimulants and opioids.
I also like that you identified alcohol as being a CNS depressant. It's also worth noting that the numbers that you're talking about here actually don't even include alcohol. Alcohol generally gets its own sort of category in many of these national surveys. So the depressant and sedative numbers that you're speaking of today, as we know,
Yeah.
are specifically about non-alcohol CNS depressants. Because if we lump alcohol in here, it skews these numbers very hard. So that's why it's often put into its own category. Next question. 3 years ago, true or false, a reported 1 in 5 injured drivers treated in trauma centers in 5 provinces across Canada tested positive for CNS depressants. What do you think? 20%. It's a pretty high number. Accept. Accept. It's a significant number. I believe our audience is quite aware, and they would be correct. Now, what do we know about some of the risks of the effects of sedatives there, Nina?
Well, sedatives can impact many of the skills that we actually need to drive safely. So they can reduce a person's alertness, slow down their reaction time, their coordination, the ability to judge distance, and even cause them to fall asleep behind the wheel. Now, these effects can last anywhere from 4 to 24 hours, depending on the drug use and the dosage. And according to a 2015 CCSA report, drivers who tested positive for the use of sedatives are 2 to 8 times more likely than alcohol and drug-free users to be involved in fatal traffic crash, a rate that's actually higher than the cannabis impaired driving. The report further stated that between the years 2010 and 2000 to 2010, 1 in 9 drivers killed in a motor vehicle collision were actually tested positive for sedatives. Now, what about riding with a driver who has used sedatives? That can be just as dangerous. Now, sedative impairment may not necessarily be obvious to everyone, which can lead passengers to believe that the person that they expect to be driving them home is safe to do so. And that's just not the case. Because passengers should avoid riding with any driver who has used sedatives in the previous few hours, particularly if they have used sedatives in a combination with alcohol or any other substances. Now, we know the main side effects, as you can see on the slide here in front of you: drowsiness, decreased coordination, dizziness, impaired judgment, and unconsciousness. But we haven't really talked about the illicit depressants like GHB and Rohypnol. They may be used legally by sexual predators to drug their unknowing victims. Now, Rohypnol is illegal in both Canada and the US, while GHB is legal, but only with a prescription provided by a healthcare practitioner. Now, illegal use, known commonly probably as spiking a drink, possession, sale, or production of either drug, can result in significant fines or even end up 14 years in prison. Now, other dangerous risks of GHB or Rohypnol use can include an overdose, which can happen suddenly even with the smallest amount of use in these substances. Now, symptoms include slowed or loss of breathing, cold body temperature, seizures, and coma. Now, to learn more about GHB and Rohypnol, you can actually visit our website and check out our Substances at a Glance series that we have.
I do want to note quickly about GHB and Rohypnol. I've been doing some work with DFK for the last number of months, particularly in central and eastern Ontario, from Peterborough over to Ottawa. And this past November, actually, in the city of Belleville, there were approximately 90 overdoses reported in the first week of November of fentanyl. And of those 90 overdoses, I believe it was 84 or 85 of them also tested positive for GHB. So this was, in many cases, these individuals taking fentanyl not knowing that they were also taking a sort of a what is known as a date rape drug at the same time. They were mixed together. And so the overdose that we saw was extremely significant and extremely, quick. And as we'll talk about a little later, the presence of a sedative with an opioid can really complicate treatment. We'll get more into that in just a moment. But it does lead us into this question here. Mixing blank with other sedatives can cause life-threatening effects. Does it include alcohol, other medications, opioids, or all of the above? What do we think? All of the above, all of the above, all of the above, other medications, all of the above. It's very important that we understand that the answer here is indeed all of the above. I realize I kind of tipped my hand a little quickly there. But what can we talk about those risks of mixing sedatives, Nina?
Well, mixing sedatives with drugs like alcohol and opioids and other medications can be extremely dangerous, even fatal. So, mixing sedatives with alcohol reduces the heart rate to life-threatening levels and can increase the risk of stupor or coma, which can also eventually requiring hospitalization. And mixing sedative with medications can cause severe drowsiness, confusion, weakness, reduced heartbeat, difficulty in breathing, and unconsciousness. Now, in 2021, the CCSA reported that sedatives were increasingly commonly found in unregulated drug supplies while being marketed as opioids. And some of these substances were improperly labeled or were mixed with drugs, so they created or even dangerous, even life-threatening risks. Earlier, we did speak about the risk of opioid overdose. The risk is significantly increased when a person mixes opioids with sedatives, as this effect slows the breathing, the respiratory rest, unconsciousness, and the risk of coma increases.
Absolutely. Now, if we're talking about overdose, I know a few moments ago, Sarah spoke about the signs of an opioid overdose. Now, Nina, if we're trying to identify what it would look like if someone's actually consumed sedatives to the point of overconsumption, what does that look like?
Well, sedative overdose can be extremely dangerous. So the misuse of any sedatives or overconsumption can cause physical symptoms ranging from disorientation, slurred speech, severe drowsiness, unconsciousness, weakness, or even staggering. As sedatives, they can cause extreme slow breathing, heart rate. Overconsumption can also cause both to drop to dangerous levels. And finally, sedatives misuse can leave a person prone to being taken advantage of or even assaulted. So if you experience or see anyone or someone experience these symptoms, it's possible they may have overconsumed on sedatives.
Now, when I was doing the run throughs of these presentations, I was asking my co facilitators this question. I'm going to turn it to the audience here. If you look at this list where we see signs of a sedative overdose and you compare it to the list that we saw a few minutes ago about the signs of an opioid overdose, are the symptoms of these two overdoses similar or are they different? What do we think? Similar? 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 They're almost identical if you think of it. There's drowsiness, there's dizziness, there's the inability to stay conscious, reduced breathing, lower heart rate. Very similar effects, right? So this leads me to my next poll question. True or false, naloxone can be used to reverse the effects of a sedative. Same symptoms, right? A lot of votes here coming in as false. This is crucially important for individuals to understand, not just care providers, but communities, youth, peers, providers in general to understand naloxone is not a cure-all. Using naloxone to treat a sedative, using naloxone to treat something other than an opioid would be like trying to take insulin for an allergic reaction. It's a medication, but that's not what it does. It has a purpose, and we will talk about it today, but it does not reverse the effects of a sedative. Nina?
Yeah, so combining sedative and opioids can obviously significantly increase the risk of drug poisoning fatalities. So, in recent data, it shows that the presence of sedatives, particularly benzodiazepines in opioids, has shown that nearly half of the drug poisoning deaths in both BC and Ontario involves sedative use either alone or more commonly mixed with drugs, particularly opioids. And in 2021, benzodiazepines were detected in two-thirds of all opioids toxicity deaths in Ontario. A significant risk to consider is that the depressants or sedatives do not respond to naloxone. That means that if a person has overdosed on sedatives, then falls unconscious and stops breathing, naloxone will not treat sedation or the unconsciousness caused by the sedative. So even though they are still they may start breathing again, the breathing may be shallow or weaker than you expect, and the person may not even wake up even after they start to breathe again. Another note, alcohol can significantly complicate this treatment as it is a depressant and shares many of the overdose symptoms with other depressants. So in this case of alcohol poisoning, an unconscious person may even vomit or may be unable to clear their throat, which can lead to the risk of choking and potentially fatal consequences can happen.
This leads us to our very last question on sedatives. Then what can we do when we suspect a sedative overdose, Nina?
Well, given the life-threatening risk of mixing opioids and sedatives, it's crucial to call 911 immediately, especially if you suspect a drug overdose and if you're uncertain of the substances that are involved. First, I would say administer naloxone to temporarily counteract the effects of opioids and stay with the individual until help arrives. Now, since a sedative overdose can make a person vulnerable to dangers and such as an assault, ensure that they are in a safe place. And if they are in public, stay with them and ensure that they are surrounded by trusted individuals until help arrives and provide assistance.
Absolutely. Wonderful job. Wonderful job. This leads us to the third and final class of drugs that we are going to talk about today, which Laura is going to join me for, being stimulants. Now, I have a question for my audience. I asked Laura this question earlier, but I'm going to ask the audience. You notice the first couple of pictures, we showed, an image of sort of different drug paraphernalia and substances for opioids. We showed sedatives, a person sleeping on a pillow. For my audience, why do you think we have stimulants with an individual jumping in the air, holding the sun in their hand? What do you think we're symbolizing here with stimulants? You think of when you see this picture? Energy? I like that. I like that energy. I think energy is lifting you up. I think that's a pretty good symbolic way of thinking about it, eh, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the audience is getting it right on. Yeah, an upper, exactly. Yeah, you guys worded that really well. So stimulants have the power to speed up the messages traveling between the brain and the body. This can cause feelings such as you feel more awake, you feel a sense of alertness, you have a burst of confidence, or maybe a burst of energy, which I know was mentioned a few times in the chat. So stimulants are so heavily normalized in today's society that many times we don't even take into consideration how often we may see the use of stimulants, or we may even use stimulants ourselves. I'm sure we all know someone who drinks coffee every day, or someone who maybe has an energy drink here or there to stay awake. Now, these are both examples of stimulants, which we'll be able to cover more as we get more so into the presentation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you mentioned the idea of stimulants, including, caffeine and nicotine. Now, I believe stimulants also classify themselves into different categories, right? If we were to sort of group them up together, right?
Yeah, so stimulants can be thought of into three different categories. So first category we're going to be discussing is the non-prescription stimulants. So examples of this would be caffeine. So caffeine could be found in coffee, in your tea, in soda if you drink soda, energy drinks, and even milk and dark chocolate. Another stimulant that falls under this category is nicotine. So this is found in tobacco and more so e-cigarettes as they become more and more popular. The second category is prescription stimulants. This is where we have our Ritalin, Adderall, Dexedrine. So these are stimulants that you could consider useful, as you could use them to treat narcolepsy as well as ADHD. The third category is illegal stimulants. So this is when we're getting into cocaine and amphetamines. So on that note, Steve, a third of Canadians that report using stimulants report high-risk use. And while noting that, it's important to know that high-risk use isn't something like having a cup of coffee each day. This is when we're talking about the more risky use of illicit stimulants, such as cocaine and amphetamines. So if we're thinking about it as 1/3 of Canadians use stimulants, 1/3 of Canadians who use stimulants also tend to report high-risk use. So for post-secondary students, this would equate to 1 in 25 overall. Now with youth, we have really been
4%,
having with youth, we have really been having these stimulant conversations for a while. So when stimulants are so widely accepted and advertised, it's really important that we start these conversations early, really diving into what stimulant use could look like.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. And I love it because it sort of leads us to this question about how normalized stimulant use is. Which of the following do you believe is the most commonly consumed psychoactive substance on the planet? Is it alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, or cannabis? You know, it's funny when we look at the CSTADs or the CADS or the CTNS, you'll notice that they always say alcohol is the most commonly consumed. Alcohol is the most commonly consumed. But you'll also notice that none of those surveys actually survey for caffeine use. Although CSTADs most recently has begun to survey for high energy drink usage. But according to CAMH, the answer far and away here is actually the use of caffeine. What do we know about stimulant use in Canada, Laura?
Yeah, so to dive a little bit deeper into normalized stimulants, caffeine is the most commonly consumed psychoactive drug in the world. In North America, being more than 80% of adults regularly consume caffeine, and the average amount of caffeine consumed per person in Canada is estimated to be about 210 to 238 milligrams a day, and that's equivalent to about 2 to 3 cups of coffee. So for teens and young adults, stuff like energy drinks have risen in popularity in the recent years, with over a third of teens currently reporting drinking energy drinks. And those energy drinks can contain 2 to 4 times the amount of caffeine than a cup of coffee, as well as other ingredients which act as stimulants, such as guarana and taurine. Meanwhile, nicotine is traditionally found in tobacco. It can also be found in vape products, which are rapidly increasing in popularity among youth, as we've talked about. And they've been shifting actually away from tobacco products in the recent years and more so towards things like e-cigarettes. So if we think about it very simply, we use caffeine as a stimulant to lift us up and make us feel more energetic and have those feelings of euphoria. Now, I'd like to open this question up to the chat panel. If you guys could just pop in a couple of examples of what happens to you when you don't get that cup of coffee or you don't have that boost of energy midway through the day. Maybe you're into energy drinks or you don't get that lift me up halfway through the day. What are some of the feelings that you tend to feel?
Oh yeah. Yeah, the headache. I was gonna say first one with me is a headache. I drink green tea like 3 or 4 times a day, and if I miss one, like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm feeling it.
Yeah,
We see
sluggish,
irritable, we see
dragging, grouchy,
sluggish.
tired. Tired is the first one I thought of when I'm not starting my day off with that cup of coffee. So this is when we're really starting to talk about withdrawals and tolerance. We develop tolerance to these stimulants, and over time, a person's body gets used to these substances, and we feel as though we need them to focus, or I need a coffee to wake up. And that's really a direct result of the stimulant use.
Exactly. And it's great because we often talk about the importance of starting conversations young. And people say, well, how do I talk about drugs with kids at a young age? Coffee is a great introductory conversation when we're talking about substance use with young people. It's something that they see their parents using, they see their guardians using, they see their care providers using. And you can have, to Laura's point, you can have conversations about tolerance with caffeine. You can have conversations about withdrawal with caffeine. You can even have conversations about when is appropriate to consume caffeine. Laura, you have 4 kids, right? Is it 4?
Yeah. Yep.
Busy. So I'm sure that
Yeah.
you would understand and they would understand that there's going to be a difference in having a cup of coffee or a pop at like noon versus having it at like 10 o'clock at night, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm sure they love to have a cup of. It's more so pop around here. They're pretty young. They're still in that stage where they think coffee is just the grossest thing in the world. So they're more into the pop, which, yeah, they definitely understand. When you drink pop or when you're using something that's gonna like lift you up, there's you're gonna have a hard time falling asleep. So definitely.
Absolutely. And again, it's great you can frame those conversations early on. Now, if we get a little bit older and we look at post-secondary age youth, so my question here for the audience is what do you believe is the most common reason that post-secondary age youth report using stimulants non-medically? Is it that feeling of high, that euphoria? Is it to work on school projects or cram for their exams, or is it to decrease appetite? School projects, school projects, appetite. Now, appetite's an interesting one because it is worth noting that stimulants can be prescribed to people living with sort of obesity or that are a little bit overweight. And one thing that we've actually learned about the use of tobacco is that nicotine actually suppresses parts of the brain that regulate feelings of hunger. This is often why when people try to quit smoking, they'll often gain 5 pounds or they'll gain 10 pounds because they start eating more to supplement these cravings that they're having that they didn't have when they were smoking tobacco or when they were vaping. But the answer here to our audience's point is largely to work on school projects or study for exams. Laura, what can we say about the impacts of stimulants on education? This is an important conversation for those students, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, so on that note, I think that we should really start off by taking into consideration high school, college, university. These are stressful times for teens and young adults. They're entering new courses. They're having an increased sense of independence. They're maybe getting their first job, first relationship. They could be moving out for the first time in their life. And these are factors that can cause stress. So 2/3 of youth who take stimulants non-medically state that they actually do so to help them stay up at night. They're cramming in studying for those exams. They want to finish working on the projects. However, it's important to note that according to the CCSA, there is actually no research that has proven that such methods are helpful. And furthermore, considering the side effects of stimulant use and stimulant withdrawal for that matter, they may even tend to have the opposite effect.
And I like that you talked about those effects, being sort of the opposite of what students are anticipating. What are some of those potential effects on the body, Laura?
So stimulant use actually does have the capability to hinder academic success. So it can cause feelings of insomnia, which comes from lack of sleep. It can affect a person's ability to retain the new information that they stayed up the night before trying to cram in. And when the stimulant effect wears off, the person is likely to feel overtired, weak, unable to focus. And furthermore, you may experience side effects such as nausea, vomiting, headaches, dizziness as a result of stimulant use. And this could ultimately affect one's ability to work on a project or complete an exam in a given time frame. Such side effects might actually prove more of a risk than a benefit to stimulant use in relation to educational success. And also speaking on the long-term effects of stimulant use. So some long-term effects include anxiety, sleep disorders, aggression and anger, suspicion, and paranoia. And they're also attributed to high blood pressure, which is a risk factor in several heart diseases.
It's funny. I always love showing and discussing these slides, especially when I'm presenting for like college programs, university programs. I remember I was at Loyalist College, I think this past January or February. And I showed them these slides. And as soon as I got into the effects of stimulant use, there were 3 students sitting up at the front. And all 3 of them the whole time were just going, I feel so attacked right now because they had just come off of writing midterms and exams. And one of them had talked about the fact they had stayed up drinking Red Bull and coffee till like 4 a.m. And then they couldn't fall asleep and their exam was at 9. So they went into the exam with like no sleep. And they were like, I bombed. They're like, I just bombed. I couldn't think. And I tried all night to stay up. And it's exactly, you think that you're giving yourself that extra boost of energy, but the more effective method of studying is still start studying early and work at it slowly, a little bit at a time every day. This is why we talk about it with students, right?
Absolutely.
Now, if we move away from prescription stimulants and we move away from those non-medical stimulants, if we move on to illicit stimulants, which of the following illegal drugs is the most commonly reported used in Canada? Is it cocaine, hallucinogens, heroin, or ecstasy? Cocaine. According to the 2019 CADS, among illegal drugs reported, 49% of the time when illegal drugs were reported, the answer was indeed cocaine. Now, there are particular regions in Canada, particular communities, particular provinces where we see cocaine numbers significantly higher. When we took a look at the CSUH data in 2020, when we looked at harms and costs, we saw cocaine numbers being a little bit higher per capita in places like Quebec and Ontario. Whereas out west, we saw a little bit higher numbers with opioids. Northern territories and northern parts of provinces were still a little bit higher with things like alcohol. But cocaine is significantly higher in really central and eastern Canada when we look at the trends and prevalences. But what else can we say about those trends with youth, Laura?
Yeah, so we can say that 7.4% of post-secondary youth report past year cocaine use, and this is actually 4 times higher rate than school-age youth, sitting at 1.6%. Methamphetamine use is not commonly reported among ages 15 to 24, sitting at below 1%. And youth who report use of these substances report doing so to feel feelings such as being invincible, intense pleasure and excitement, or even to cope with things such as depression and stress. So when talking about illicit stimulant risks, cocaine overdose can actually be fatal, causing abnormal heartbeat, stroke, seizures, or respiratory arrest. So cocaine is a highly addictive substance, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and withdrawal from cocaine can cause exhaustion, extended and restless sleep or sleeplessness, hunger, irritability, depression, suicidal thoughts, and even intense cravings for more of the drug. And use of cocaine during pregnancy can cause miscarriage, premature birth, low birth weight in infants, as well as neonatal abstinence syndrome. So in addition to sharing the risk mentioned by cocaine, meth can cause symptoms such as rotting teeth, anorexia, brain damage, severe skin and organ damage, including damage to the kidneys, liver, heart, and lungs. And the mental health risks that follow with it as well include issues with impulse control, issues with memory, feelings of aggressiveness, suicidal feelings, which become more severe when the person is entering that withdrawal period. So an additional risk of meth use is related not only to its consumption, but to the preparation of the drug itself. So methamphetamine can be made illegally in homes, warehouses, car trunks, which are often referred to as clandestine laboratories, or also known as meth labs. So these labs pose risks of fires, explosions due to mixing extremely flammable products, as well as air poisoning, contaminating soil or water supplies due to dumping toxic chemicals, and exposing the communities around them to very strong and dangerous drugs.
Absolutely. Now, we talked about the fact that stimulants really have a different effect, right? You mentioned that they bring a lot of like an upper effect. And when Sarah and Nina were talking about opioids and sedatives, we saw a lot more of like a depressing effect, a slowdown of the system. Now, there are some people that believe if they want to feel the, I'll say, more desired effects of one and the undesired effects feeling less, what they'll believe is that they can simply mix these substances together. So I'm going to turn this to the audience. True or false? Mixing depressants and stimulants together is safe because their effects simply cancel each other out. It's a common misconception held by youth. They use a depressant, they lose the ability to focus, they use the ability to think straight. They think, well, if I take a substance that's going to make me think straight, well, then I can still feel drunk, but still have a good time. Or if they take a stimulant, they're worried about the anxiety. They think, well, I'm going to take a depressant to calm myself down. This isn't exactly true, as our audience knows. Laura, what can we say on this topic?
Well, while a stimulant may cause a person to feel more up, which we've talked about, alcohol forces the body to feel down. So really you're mixing an upper with a downer, and this is where the body gets confused and the body doesn't know how to react. So sedatives are known for their ability to slow functions in the body, creating feelings of you feel relaxed, your energy levels are lower. You're maybe drowsy, you're maybe confused. And although one might think that a solution to these issues would be to mix a stimulant with a sedative in order to experience the benefits of both of them, they don't counteract the unwanted side effects. But drugs do not work this way. And in fact, mixing substances increase the risk of an overdose. And by taking a stimulant with alcohol may cause a person not to feel impaired or as impaired as they would be otherwise. This could potentially lead them to drinking more alcohol. So as they consume more of either or both of the substances, this increases the risk of adverse effects. The depressing effects of the alcohol and other sedatives may lessen the perceived or desired effects of the stimulant, causing a person to take more in order to feel the desired effects. And again, even though they are not experiencing the effects they desire, this does not mean that the complications or side effects are being offset. So when having this discussion, it's really important to remember that mixing stimulants with other medications, such as cough suppressants or over-the-counter medications, can also cause significant risks. And if you are taking any prescription medications, it is best to ask your doctor about any risks of using them alongside any other medications, alcohol, or drugs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to see if our audience caught it. You mentioned it very quickly in passing. I'm going to see if the audience caught it. Do you know how many Canadians that use stimulants? And I'm not talking caffeine, nicotine. I'm talking the rest of the list. How many Canadians that report the use of stimulants report high risk use? Would they say 1 in 3, 1 in 8, 1 in 10, or 1 in 15? What's our audience think here? 1 in 10, 1 in 8, 1 in 10. This number is actually far more significant than people realize. The number actually comes in around 1 in 3. About a third of Canadians that currently use stimulants do report meeting the criteria for high risk use, meaning that they feel the need to take more to feel the same effects. They feel unwell when they can't take. They mix with other substances. They report doing or behaving in ways that they're not necessarily comfortable with when they're consuming, or they're consuming to the point that they're experiencing medical harms and even in some cases requiring hospitalization. This number is significant. Like I said, it's about 1 in 3 people who report using stimulants. And if we look at the post-secondary level, that's approximately 4% of post-secondary students overall. A significant number.
Yeah.
Now, Sarah and Nina explained signs of overdose when we look at opioids and when we look at sedatives. And we just with the fact these lists were really similar. Now, Laura, some of the signs of a stimulant overdose.
So some signs of a stimulant overdose could include seizures, psychotic episodes, dangerously high blood temperature, labored breathing, respiratory failure, convulsions or coma, extremely high blood pressure, heart attack, and even stroke.
Absolutely. So, I mean, these risks can be very, very immediate. And I mean, one of the things when we look at cocaine and methamphetamine is there is that risk of heart attack or heart failure, even with young adults. And many young adults don't really understand that. They believe that a heart attack is something completely distal to them, that they wouldn't experience that for another 30 or 40 years. But individuals that use stimulants, particularly illicit stimulants, will find themselves at risk of these things regardless of their age. Which leads us to our next question, is the role of stimulants in the current overdose crisis. More or less than half of accidental apparent opioid deaths last year also involved a stimulant. What does our audience think? More? Really talks about why we don't refer to this as simply an opioid problem anymore, right? The answer is indeed more. Laura, what can we say about the numbers?
Yeah, so similar to sedatives, naloxone does not counter the effects of a stimulant. So 54% of opioid toxicity deaths in the first half of 2023 involved the stimulant. 81% of stimulant toxicity deaths involved an opioid, and the percentage of all stimulant-related poisoning hospitalizations that involved fentanyl and its analogs has increased to 154%, and that's since 2018.
So then what can you do if you suspect a stimulant overdose?
So if you suspect a stimulant overdose, the first step you want to take is to call 911. Even though naloxone does not treat a stimulant overdose, it can help if the person has also taken opioids, either knowingly or unknowingly. And since the unregulated drug supply is commonly contaminated with opioids, as well as stimulants and sedatives, having a naloxone kit can help save lives. And even if the person believes that they took a stimulant without knowing it contained heroin, oxycodone, or fentanyl, it is still important to have that naloxone kit on hand. So if you have to give naloxone or suspect you are seeing or experiencing an overdose, you should always call emergency medical services and stay with the person in need until help arrives. It could result in saving a life.
You're absolutely right. Now, covered a lot of content on 3 classes of drugs in the last 60 minutes. And we know we've got this presentation running up till about 1:30 or 2:30, but we're probably going to wrap up in about 15 minutes. We want to make sure we get to the sort of the last section here and then allow time for that last 15, 20 minutes for questions. Now, parents, educators, and adults involved in youth lives make a difference. We know you do. And part of the way that you do that is by keeping up on the research and keeping up on the knowledge of the state of the ongoing sort of, I'll say, drug market and drug sort of sector that we see here in the country. So you being here today is a very important step in that process. And you help to prevent those risks of youth substance use and those harms associated with youth substance use. We're going to talk about how we do that here. The first thing to consider is the question of how can I tell if a youth is using substances? In past presentations and in past workshops that I've done over the years, we always talk about like signs of use. One of the things that we understand when we look at sedatives, when we look at opioids, when we look at stimulants, is that it's not always apparent that a youth is using. But it comes back to that question of why they're using becomes all the more important. It's important not to jump to conclusions that any changes in your child or youth behavior are due, in fact, or related exclusively to the presence of a substance. I mean, Laura alluded to this, Sarah alluded to this. Adolescence is a period of change. Young people are going through new jobs, they're going through new courses, they've got new friends, new relationships, they're moving away from home, they're experiencing their financial freedom for the first time, but having to learn how to budget, they're getting their first car, they're going out to more parties. A lot of these things can be very strenuous. They can be very stressful, they can be very overwhelming. And in response to the changes going on in a youth's life, you will see changes in their behavior. And to jump to any assumption that any physical telltale signs of a substance use automatically mean that they're using can sometimes lead to preconceived notions and judgment. If you notice these changes at all, you don't take it as an opportunity to say this person is automatically using. You take it as an opportunity to speak with them, to have an open and an honest conversation, to ask them questions, to check in on how they're feeling, to check in on what's going on in their life. Because the more that you do that, the more you create that space of support, the more you create that space of trust and of being honest. And the more open you've been in being able to have these accessible conversations early on in life, which we alluded to in the last section, the more likely you are to have these conversations with the goal of supporting your child, the more likely they are to be willing and comfortable to disclose either their use or the use of someone else around you. We're trying to engage that conversation. It's not about forcing diagnosis on. It's about trying to offer support. And that's what becomes all the more important when it comes to reducing stigma. We also know that substance use exists on a spectrum. For a long time, substances were either seen as either you don't use or there's something morally wrong with you if you do use. That was the old abstinence only programs, the Just Say No campaigns. You'll notice when Laura, when Sarah, when Nina were discussing substances, at no point did they ever say that these drugs were bad. At no point did they ever say these drugs were good. There's no morality in conversation around substance use. It's simply understanding we're on a spectrum of use we're discussing. The first portion is non-use. Most people don't use substances. Alcohol is an exception, as we know the majority of Canadians over the age of 19 consume. And cannabis, we see 19 to 24. That number comes in around 50%. We talk about cannabis and alcohol more in other workshops. But for the most part, people do not use these substances. 1 in 8 people use opioids. Well, that means 7 out of 8 don't. 1 in 10 people use CNS depressants. That means 9 out of 10 don't. Most people don't use substances. And we know that abstinence is the most effective method of reducing harm, but not everyone is going to. We understand and we respect the fact that people have choice. And when we look at the substances we talked about today, all 3 of them have beneficial use. It's indisputable. There's prescribed legal use that can have positive health, social, and spiritual effects. But the issue is that does not mean they are risk-free. These substances need to be used as directed. They need to be used in consultation with your healthcare provider and those around you to ensure that they're checking in on your wellness. We know substance use can be seen at a low risk level. We talk about low risk guidelines when it comes to cannabis use, when it comes to alcohol use. There are low risk guidelines and suggestions, which we'll talk about for sedatives and opioids and stimulants in the next slide. Now, low risk use is whereby we see someone using a substance and it may harm them slightly. We take alcohol as an example. Let's say someone has a few drinks periodically, but they designate a driver. They're not mixing with other drugs. They're using alcohol sort of as its own substance without other things involved. They're not using if they have to work the next day. They're using for fun. They may say something embarrassing while they're impaired. They may be dizzy or disoriented and slip and fall and hurt themselves. Those are still risks, but they're not as significant as where we see higher risks, that the substance use is becoming more commonplace. They're beginning to consume to feel the same levels of pleasure that they did before, or feeling unwell when they can't use. They're beginning to use either in secret or changing the surroundings of the people that they're sort of associating with, and really sort of distancing themselves from their other interests and their other activities. And they're beginning to experience more and more health risks. This is where we see an increase in risk. And finally, where we see addiction is the point whereby we see a treatable or medical condition that involves the compulsive use of a substance, despite its perceived or ongoing or apparent or clear negative effects or impacts. Now, it's also important I talk about this anytime I bring up a spectrum, and I've done this for years. People move back and forth on this. This is not a one-way street. We do not see people move from beneficial to addictive use in every case. That does not always happen. We see some people begin to use a substance, a prescription, opioids being an example. The prescription ends, they continue using, they begin to experience more harms. They may struggle with dependency. You may have others that finish up a prescription and they go back to non-use. Some people will use a substance at low risk for their entire life. Some people will struggle with addiction for their whole life. Some people will never use. Understanding this spectrum helps to understand the importance of, again, meeting an individual where they're at and being able to tailor your conversation to the knowledge of the things we discussed today, the practices we're going to discuss here in these last few slides, and really being able to sort of allow them to feel empowered to speak about their own experiences. Now, I talked a moment ago about low-risk drinking guidelines and low-risk cannabis use guidelines. There are recommendations for reducing the risk of the substances that we've discussed today. First and foremost is the importance of using the stimulants, sedatives, and opioids only as prescribed and directed. And please return any unused medications to a pharmacy. Earlier on, it was mentioned, I believe Sarah mentioned it, that DFK helps to coordinate National Drug Drop-Off Month, being in the month of August. However, you can return unused prescription medications to a pharmacy at any time of the year. We just bring it up in August as that month when we raise that awareness. Please only use substances from trusted sources. As we know, the illicit drug supply, particularly from those that we don't know where we're getting a substance from, has increasingly become confused, tainted, and mixed with other drugs that we don't even know we're taking. Again, we hear these stories almost every day of an individual taking a substance, overdosing, and testing positive for something completely different than they thought they've taken. We've seen this in Kingston with methamphetamine. We saw it in Belleville with GHB and fentanyl. This past February, we saw it in Belleville with fentanyl and xylazine, which is an animal tranquilizer whose use can actually result in things like necrosis and organ failure. Peel Region, where I do work with some of the harm reduction committee out there, they've talked about the presence of xylazine being found in fentanyl. In the States, we see xylazine. In Canada, across the country, we see over half of opioid overdoses also testing positive for cocaine. So there's still a significant presence of unwanted or unknown substances being mixed in the unregulated source. This is why it's important to use from trusted sources. And if someone has a substance that they're using, we often point them to places like safe consumption sites where they can get their drugs tested so that they know what it is they're getting. Pick up a naloxone kit from your local pharmacy. Put it in your first aid kit. Some people will criticize the idea of having naloxone, and they say, well, if I have naloxone in my house, that means I'm permitting people to use opioids. That's not it. That would be like saying I have bandages in my house because I'm permitting people to get hurt. You're acknowledging that it can happen. You put naloxone in your house, even if you don't use, because you don't know the status of someone who comes to your door. You don't know if they've used a substance. You don't know how they're feeling. It's good to have it on hand and not need it. You avoid mixing alcohol, medications, and drugs. You designate a sober driver. You avoid substance use if you're pregnant, have a history of psychological or substance use disorders. And finally, use in a safe space with people that you trust and seek medical attention as necessary. Very last poll question I'm going to ask you for today is about the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act. I've talked about this for the last few years. In this presentation in particular, it is crucial youth understand this. If someone calls 911 to report an overdose, the person who overdosed will be charged for possession of a controlled substance. Is this true, or do we challenge this? A lot of challenges popping up here. You would be correct to challenge this. All Canadians, regardless of age, are protected under what is known as the Good Samaritan Overdose Act. A factor that can prevent someone from calling emergency services is the fear of breaking the law. They don't want to get in trouble when they call EMS. Youth may not want to call overdose or call to report an overdose because, again, they're afraid of getting into trouble, but the risk of harm and the risk of fatality is significant, particularly with the overdose of sedatives, stimulants, and opioids. Now, in 2017, the Government of Canada signed into effect the Good Samaritan Overdose Act as a measure to protect individuals seeking help during an overdose. They will not be charged for misdemeanor possession or breach of conditions of release, probation, or parole. It is to ensure that they can get the support that they need because the safety of their life supersedes the need to charge them. And Wendy, you summed up perfectly what I was going to say in the next point. The Act does not provide legal protection against other or more serious offenses. So if emergency services show up and they find an individual who's overdosed, they're non-responsive. They will treat them. They will ask if someone knows what they've taken, so they have an idea of how to treat them. Because if they know what they've taken, they can get them started on certain responses, and then they're going to take them for service. Now, if EMS shows up and they find a different law being broken, or an outstanding warrant, or they find a drug factory or meth lab, or they find an assault being committed, people are not. It's not a full protection against everything in the situation. A deportation order, precisely. It's protection specifically for the overdose. And again, this is a significant barrier that youth don't understand, so they may not want to make that call. This is just a way to remind them that they do have some legal protection. Now, when we talk about youth with substance use, we've actually kind of been doing this the whole time. We recommend using the following substances, and I'm glad I've been able to co-facilitate today because it's an opportunity to do this with other people. First thing is to get informed. We threw a lot of information at you today. And we are doing a recording of this. You'll have it available if you want to check back. We will also be posting a recording on the website, so you can check in at any time. You start young. Conversations about substance use begin very early in life. Some people will say they would rather wait until someone is of legal age to consume, but the problem is we know they begin substance use during their adolescence and early teenage years. So we promote the importance of starting a conversation with youth, with young people. And it can start with a conversation as simple as discussing the effects of caffeine, why it's appropriate to have it sometimes and not others. The effects of alcohol as we get a little bit older, seeing parents or seeing peers beginning to consume and understanding those risks. The risks of cannabis as we get into our preteen and our teenage years, where we see that age of onset use begin. So that when these more complicated substances and these more, my CEO often, or my ED often refers to them as substances with less of a margin of error in the case of opioids. That these conversations may seem difficult, but if we've been discussing substances for years, we're building up to that. We're cultivating trust. You keep the conversation casual, practice active listening strategies, asking open-ended questions, summarizing what your clients are saying, showing them that you care, offering empathy and compassion, as opposed to just simply saying, well, that's too bad. No, it's asking them questions and saying, I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you're telling me. Tell me more. I want to know more. What makes you say that? Keep bringing those things up. And finally, consider your language. We have to cover a lot of technical terminology in these presentations. That's why we geared this presentation specifically towards care providers. We understand you need to know the theory. But the language you use when you speak with your clients, when the language you use when you speak with your families, your friends, your kids, you understand it's not going to come out of a textbook. It has to feel more personable. And having that ability to do that will make them feel more comfortable speaking with you. We offer praise and reward. That's an important thing to do with young people, especially when they're exhibiting, say, healthy behaviors, positive behaviors. Let's say they're dealing with stress and they come and they speak with you about that. Praise that. Reward that. Consider all aspects of substance use. If a youth discloses that they're using cocaine, if a youth discloses that they've tried fentanyl, if a youth discloses that they're drinking, consider why they're using. Ask them what sort of factors have led them to making that decision. What are they trying to feel? Instead of simply labeling or judging them for that use. You want to ask more. You want to learn more. Check in with your youth, get to know their friends, get to know their parents, stay in touch with the adults that they trust. For families, we always recommend the importance of spending quality time together, doing events that can be enjoyed as a family, and most of all, supporting young people and supporting the clients no matter what. We deal with clients that we may feel are hard to connect with or hard to support. They make mistakes. We all make mistakes. This presentation today, we had moments, we had hiccups in the presentation, but you just move forward, right? You understand mistakes happen. They can be small, they can be menial, they can be far more significant. But no matter where you're discussing with your client, no matter what you're discussing with your client, you still support them. That's what makes you effective, even on the days it's not easy to do. Last slide, I always like to show this one. It pops right off the DFK website. It's been there for several years, comes out in our Cannabis Talk Kit, is the importance of language. What language matters? Well, when you say a word like but, you came home with a designated driver. That's great, but why did you have to drink at that party? In saying the word but, you've created an argument. Instead, you build off the things that they're saying. You designated a driver, you came home safe. That's great. And how did the party go? And what are you going to do next time? And how are you going to continue that behavior? You build off of these conversations. Even changing the word but in a sentence to the word and, it invites more conversation. Instead of telling a kid what they should do, tell them what you'd like them to do. This communicates the fact you care as opposed to trying to sound like an authority. As opposed to signaling or labeling drugs as being bad or stupid. Again, you'll notice at no point during the presentation did we say drugs were bad. We never said they were good. They're tools, but they have risk. Substances can be harmful. Substances can be unhealthy. To call them bad or stupid is labeling the individual using as that language. It's stigmatizing language. And finally, instead of talking about disapproval and disappointment, we talk about concern, we talk about worry. Because there you're communicating the fact I care. I'm saying this because I care. If I say I'm disappointed in a youth, there's no coming back from that. They've let me down. The fact they've come to me, the fact they're still there, means that I'm worried, means that I care, sure. And I want to keep showing that. If I show disappointment, if I disapprove of their behavior, that's just pushing them away. Instead, you point out these things because you care. That list you see on the right invites conversation. That list you see on the left shuts it down. Very last thing I'm going to say before we wrap up today is to thank all of you for coming in. You will see a handy dandy QR code on the screen here for our post-workshop survey. Please feel free to take a moment. You can grab your phones and click a picture of it. You know, and your phone will take you right to it. Please take a moment to fill out the survey. It makes our funder very happy that they see that we're getting responses here. But we've got about, 10 minutes left before we wrap up and hit the bottom of the hour. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat panel. We'll stick around for another few minutes. And while we're waiting, Nina, Sarah, Laura, do you guys have anything else you want to add while we're here?
I think you covered a lot. I think there's a lot of information here for everyone to take in. I don't think we missed anything. Sarah, Laura?
I say you covered a lot. I just asked questions and ran. You covered a lot.
Yeah, I guess, Sarah, if you don't have anything to add, I would just like to quickly thank everyone for coming out and listening to our presentation. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And I guess if you have any questions, Steve, now I guess would be the right time to go ahead and put those in the chat.
You see a question there in the Q&A. The question that Brooke had about sedatives while driving, what it is it's the risk of sedatives while driving. So the risk of using cannabis, so cannabis impairment resulting in collision, we see the risk comes in at around 2 to 4 times higher. The use of sedatives while driving, actually the risk falls between 2 to 8 times as great. So the risk of sedatives on being involved in a collision is actually higher than the risk of cannabis use. So the rate is higher with cannabis, but the risk, if you actually take a look at the percentage, is actually higher among sedatives. So, but again, that's not to discount the risk of cannabis impaired driving, which we do know is significant. We talk about in one of our other workshops as well. Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So while we do that, I do want to just take a quick moment. Say if you have any questions, please feel free to visit our website. You can check us out anytime, or you can always send me an email if you'd like to learn a little bit more about what we have going on. What can one do if a misuse of medications is being distributed in hospitals? Well, that's an excellent question. So in this case, I think that I've actually never been asked that question before. I think the only response that I could possibly give without having an opportunity to really dive into it too far would be to inquire with the hospital itself, to reach out to the administration and say that you've noticed this or you've identified this, and really having them check in with it, because it's really a sectoral issue there. I couldn't speak to an experience of that happening. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't, but again, it's a great question. I've never actually been asked that one before, being distributed at the hospital level. Well, we know there is absolutely that importance of ensuring that an individual is getting the right substance they need, but if they're getting too much, or if they're getting sort of the wrong products, then it's very difficult to say what can be done in that situation. My best suggestion would be to connect with the hospital's administration and point this out as quickly as possible. I know I wish I could give you a better answer for that. I've never been asked that before. I would take that back. I work with a lot of the health units here in Ontario. That would actually be one that I bring back to them and see sort of what they would say in a response. A great question. It's just gonna sit on my mind for the rest of the afternoon. I gotta send some emails. I don't see any other questions popping up. So I do want to thank y'all for coming in. We certainly hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Like I said, feel free to email me if you have any other questions. Okay, so you have reporting protocols. It's good. I'm glad to hear that, Robin. Thank you. Yeah, again, it would be something that you would have to take up with the sort of administrative level first. But yeah. Otherwise, I think what we can do for the day is conclude our recording. I want to thank you all again. We hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. And feel free to pop in and check in any of the workshops we have coming up in the next number of months. Thank you so much, everyone.